From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
2 years in Europe.
I'm George Zavadil from Towson, Maryland. I was with the U.S. Coast Guard. Served 4 years and 4 days, 3 theaters, 2 ships, and was glad to go home.
I'm Jerry Brenner. I served in the United States Army, 12th Corps, 3rd Army, 2 years in the European theater.
Pass that down.
John Sudik here, and I served with the U.S. Army for 3 years and served in the European Theater of Operations.
Yeah, I'm Captain Bob Bloxham. Was in the merchant service all during the war, then went in the Coast Guard in 1950 and retired in 1974. Live in Virginia near Williamsburg.
Very good. As you can see, we're going to have stories from land and sea on this panel. And I'm going to start it off with Joe once again. And Joe, why don't you share some of your memories of your first day in combat when you landed in France? You landed in southern France in October of '44.
Well, we landed in Marseille, France in '44, and the idea of that was to relieve the Normandy pressure, and that would spread the German forces thinner. And my first day in the combat, we were moving up there, and I seen a German soldier. He was coming out of his foxhole, but half his head was gone. And then that's when I started to get scared. This is for real. Then it just goes on and on and on, and you wonder if it's your day. That's about it.
Well, and I interviewed Mr. DeLuca for the Veterans History Project, and he has a very interesting story about a close call fairly early on in your tour in France.
Well, really, everything's a close call. But this one particular time, we were sort of pinned down, and two of the guys went out in the field, and they wanted to cut the barbed wire. And somebody hollered for a wire cutter. Well, I didn't carry it, but before I knew it, wire cutter was in my hand, and their machine gun and our machine gun was having a duel, and tracers flying all over the place. But I ran out there and handed them the wire cutters, and then I was standing in back of them. Then there was 2 quick shots, and the one guy on my right was hit in the neck, and he was dead before he hit the ground. Then the sergeant was hit in the arm, and we both hit the ground. And I sure wanted to get out of there, but I couldn't leave the sergeant. He was the dead guy. We'd take care of him later. So I drug him through the machine gun fire and got him back to safety. And the thing is, if I'd thought of myself and ran back to save myself and left him wounded, they wouldn't have trusted me. And that's how you survive. Each of you are protecting each other's back.
Thanks. John, you were part of the D-Day invasion. Didn't actually land on June 6th, is that correct? Go ahead and tell us about that.
Yes, Tom, we didn't land on D-Day. We were supposed to land the next morning, but the Omaha beach was a bad beach. The Germans are pretty dug in and everything, and we didn't have a good foothold. So we were setting out in our LST out in the water, waiting to land, and we were very vulnerable. Any little stray bullet or a shell or anything, even the tracer bullet going through a gas can would immediately ignite it, and away we'd go. When I thought about the possibilities of going overboard in case that happened, we did have some air raids and some artillery shells come in, but the air raid at night, when we were shooting at the German planes, it looked like it was raining up, and every 5th shell is a tracer, and they have to come down. So they're coming down and hitting the ship and so forth and all things. But the next day, I had my shoes unbuckled in case we had to abandon ship, in case we got hit, and I looked in the water and there was thousands and thousands of jellyfish. And the only person I heard talk about this before was Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent. And I thought if we ever got overboard, we'd be stung to death. We prepared for the landing. We were in the assault force. We're Corps artillery. We wouldn't belong to any division. We belonged to a corps. And a corps has control of maybe 4 or 5 divisions or so. So we were prepared for chemical warfare and also anything else that occurred. But the chemical warfare was a problem. We had impregnated clothing on. Our shoes were covered on the outside with a grease, and we all had to take this grease in our hand and work it inside our shoes. And consequently, your sock has to go into that. Well, after a few days and weeks, why, it's just miserable, it's sticky. But we had to have this protection in case there was a chemical attack against us.
Yes, and there was a very real fear when we finally landed in Fortress Europe that the Germans might use chemical warfare to stop the invasion, but they thought better of it. Let's get over here to George and talk a little bit about your job at sea and life at sea.
I feel a little embarrassed after hearing this story because all we did was haul the bullets and the beans that were being used. But we did go ahead and ran convoys over to the Mediterranean, so I had the tour that you sign up for in peacetime, you know, join the Navy and see the world. But the Coast Guard was incorporated in the Navy in World War II by presidential order on November 1941, and the very next month the Japanese struck and we were full-fledged. But after hearing of what's gone on here, just convoying ships back and forth doesn't sound like it's a very dangerous situation. And the only thing that I can say is that we had Marines we took up to Bougainville for replacements, and these kids, and we were all kids, but these kids would be on deck, and they were scared to get down the hold because they didn't want to get hit by anything big. They'd rather go out in the jungle and take it out there. So, in the Pacific, we were very fortunate in that as an AK, which is a Liberty ship, turned over to the Navy, we just supplied whatever they needed to go ashore and win the war. So I feel that we did what we were told, but it certainly wasn't as gallant as these other guys.
I'm going to go out of order a little bit, so adjust it. Let's go ahead and go to Mr. Bloxham, and you can tell us a little bit about life at sea.
Yeah, well, life at sea was always pleasant. There's nothing like standing on the bridge of a ship and looking all the way around, and all you see is water, and at night all you see are the stars are bright as all get out. So it is a pleasure to be at sea. Of course, you miss your girlfriend or wives, that's for sure. But I came off the Pennsylvania school ship and went on a World War I built cargo vessel. It was a real surprise. I had slept in a hammock on the school ship, and here I had my own room and a mess boy to keep it clean and make it up. And then we made a trip to South Africa, and coming back we were to go in Trinidad to fuel. And we started in through the Boca de Navia, the entrance to Lake Trinidad, and the shore station was flashing like mad. And I tried to read them. They were too fast for me. We called the cadet. He couldn't read it. We called the second mate. He couldn't read it. The old man came up, and the old man couldn't read it, so they got the radio operator. And finally he says, we read it, and he says, "You're standing into a minefield." Well, we did a 180 in a hurry and went back out. But when we went back in, it looked like we went through the same place that we had gone through before. And we just held our breath and didn't have any problem.
Very good. Jerry, do you have memories of your first day under fire?
Well, not the first day on the fire, but I do have some memories of the first couple of weeks. We were a heavy artillery unit, which meant we had a large 8-inch howitzer gun, which could shoot a 100-pound shell 15 to 18 miles. So obviously, we were of no use the first days of after the D-Day, and there would be no place to put us. But eventually, we did move on to the beach in August, and we had our first firing position outside of Saint-Marie-Église. We fought our way through Normandy and up through the Brest Peninsula. And then there was the breakthrough at Saint-Lô, and we began to race through the countryside of France, and I experienced something which I will never forget the rest of my life. And with your permission, I'd like to read part of a letter that I wrote home to my wife describing that experience. The country we traveled through went through a lot more hardships from the Germans than the place we had left. The result was noticeable in their acceptance of the Americans. We traveled many miles and many, many hours, but I was excited and worked up all the time. I've seen it in the movies, I've read about it in the papers, and heard descriptions on the radio. Now it was happening to me. All along the route, people were gathered to watch us go by. We were greeted with hysterical shouts of "Viva l'American," and showered with flowers, apples, pears, berries, and fresh eggs were thrust into our hands. In the towns, they were lined 6 deep in the streets, yelling, screaming, and crying. Whenever a vehicle had to stop, we were mobbed by old and young who just wanted to touch our hands. One old lady grabbed my hand and soaked it with her tears and kisses. That flower that I'm enclosing is the first one presented to me. It was given to me by a little boy about 5 years old who was pushed forward by his sister. I talked to her and found that their father was a prisoner in Germany and had been there for 4 years. When we rode through the towns, I would stand up in the Jeep giving the V for victory sign, and every time a crowd shouted "Viva l'American," I answered "Viva la France," victory. They nearly went crazy. Along the country roads, the peasants at the edge of the road with bottles of cognac and good cider. They had glasses and begged every car to stop so they could offer us some. Some of the people endangered their lives by standing well out in the road with hands extended so that they could touch us as we went by. Before long, our Jeep was covered with flowers, and we ourselves had them stuck all over us. We also had a dozen eggs. I didn't get a chance to eat with them yet. We passed through a large city, and I got an idea what the victory parade was like. People hung from the roofs and windows. They lined the streets and lanes. Flags were draped everywhere. Women thrust their babies at us to be touched by the magic hand. The sight of me standing up with hands extended and the well-known V seemed to excite them more. They greeted me with a great shout. It was here that when I said "Viva la France," I was answered "Non, non, Viva l'American." Never have I seen such hysterical joy anywhere. And it was evident in everybody, old and young. It was an unforgettable experience, one that will remain with me of the most thrilling I've ever experienced. It made me proud to be American and brought home to me what we had accomplished and what we were going to accomplish in France and in Europe.
For those of you, and this would not include me, for those of you who spent time in the service at sea in the Pacific, there was a rather interesting ceremony that they would go through, an initiation ceremony when you cross the equator. George is going to tell us about that.
First, I'd like to go back on discussing the French enthusiasm, and let's hope it comes forward now into the year of 2004. It could be well used. See, I don't have any real big sea stories or land stories to tell, so I have to tell about customs uses and traditions. And when you cross the equator, not on a cruise ship, they don't go and do the things and the indignations that they heap upon the sailor. But when you cross the equator, you are known as a polywog if you have never crossed it before. And once you get across, they get through the initiation, then you become a shellback, and you don't have to go through it anymore. But since there's no, it's like a college hazing without the degree. You get, usually you get covered with grease and tar, and your hair gets shaved off to zip. And the final indignation is they throw you in a big tub of water that they, in our ship, they created by putting the hatch covers together, Kansas hatch covers together, and created a big pool and just dumped us in. And we had aboard as supernumeraries 6 Royal Air Force, Royal New Zealanders, and Royal Australians, total of 6. And of course, they didn't want to go through it because they were going to report to a different ship in a different country. And what happened was one of them actually got up and climbed the mast and went into the crow's nest, and stayed up there until he had to come down. And at that time, they grabbed him, cut his hair, and threw him in the water. So he went to his ship looking as bald as we did. And I was pretty bald. And I got into Auckland, New Zealand, and I was an unmarried ensign at the time. And it's not exactly an appealing situation to meet a young lady, take your hat off, and you're as bald as an egg. So that particular incident is remembered a long time as a young man, which we all were.
Thanks, George. Joe would probably be the only person, well, of course, is the only person who would be considered a grunt because he was with the 103rd Infantry Division. Joe, if you could tell us a little bit about your life in the foxhole, and in particular, he told me a story when we recorded his oral history about having a snack in a foxhole. You remember that story?
What's that again?
Having a snack in the foxhole?
Okay. We were in a vineyard there in France, and we got pinned down. And the way the terrain was, we couldn't flank the machine gun, so we had to wait for a tank to come up. And I was in a little gully, and I didn't think it was deep enough, so I started digging with my hands. Then my elbow went up when I was pushing the dirt out, and a bullet come flying through right in front of me and threw dirt in my face. And I thought, man, I have to get back down deeper. So I started digging again, and my elbow went up again, and he missed me again. And I thought, well, if I stay flat, I'll be okay. So I flattened out as much as I could, and here I'm pinned down by a sniper, and I had some crackers in my jacket. So I'm laying there pinned down, and I'm eating crackers.
Very good, thank you. John, your outfit was involved in the liberation of Paris. And I also recorded John's oral history for the Veterans History Project, and you told me an interesting little story about the liberation of Paris.
Let's see. No, that's not working. That's better? Yeah. Yeah, we were at the bridge, the beachhead, and waiting for a breakthrough. So we're transferred from our 5th Corps and 1st Army to the 3rd Army with General Patton. And we made a breakthrough sweeping in behind the lines of the German lines in the middle of the night with a convoy with the Germans shooting at us with small arms fire from all the little streets and villages and houses. And consequently, it was kind of a precarious situation. We swept around and got what they call to the point what they call Filet Gap. And the British and the Canadians were coming down from the beachhead, and they met us. And we surrounded some 100,000 German troops. From there, it was sort of a cakewalk to get into Paris. Well, we got into Paris, but we found out that the American soldiers weren't allowed to parade through Paris first. The French had to do it. The French had a lot of men and material that they were given by the Americans in England and they formed the 2nd French Armored Division under General Leclerc. So it was de Gaulle in the picture. It was sort of a political thing to let the French go through Paris first, and we followed them up. We were supporting the 28th Infantry Division through Paris, and we followed them through on what we call a second parade. But it's quite an emotional experience to drive down a street like any main avenue, and thousands upon thousands of people weeping, crying, girls coming up to our vehicles and kissing us. Ooh la la, they had these big hairdos on them, you know. And oh, we were elated, you know. We said, God, this was something. So the bad part of the picture was some of these, at this occasion, we found that some ladies had their heads shaved and the swastika was imprinted on their foreheads. And they're being chased out of town by throwing vegetables at them or whatever. But we went through Paris. We'd go about 100 feet, stop. They'd clamor all over us again, past the Arc of Triomphe. They'd go another 200 feet. They'd clamor all us over again. We had to stop. We'd throw them chocolate. And one of the things they enjoyed, one of the things most they enjoyed that we give them out of our K ration, you'd never believe it was, what it was. Anybody have an idea? No chewing gum? No. I'll tell you what it was. In every pack of K ration, there was a packet of toilet paper. They liked that toilet paper. So we chased the Germans out of town. We never stayed in town that night and headed towards the German border.
Very good. Jerry, you have...
Did you ever see khaki toilet paper?
Keep the microphone, Jerry. I want to ask you about your memories of the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah. Well, we fought through France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. And in October of 1944, we pulled into an area 6 miles east of St. Vith, Belgium. And there we stayed until the Battle of the Bulge began. For your information, St. Vith was a main railroad and truck crossing and proved to be the first point that the Germans were aiming for when the battle started. I was with the headquarters battery of this field artillery unit, and I was a radio repairman and radio operator. And we were, as I say, in this small town. Our firing batteries were in other small towns in the area, and we kept contact with them through the radio. And it was my turn to be on the radio from the 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. shift on December the 15th, 1944. And at 5 o'clock in the morning, I got a very frenzied call from one of the firing batteries, one of the lieutenants in charge there, who said he looked out of his window and he saw German tanks coming down the road in the mist. And that was the very beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. Well, needless to say, we had to hurry up and get ourselves out of there. And for 5 days and for 5 nights, we ran in the opposite direction from what we had been doing for months. And it was a terrible feeling. But we had been so exposed to being victorious that being in the position of running from the enemy was not very good. And for those 5 days and 5 nights, we didn't have any real food to eat because the cook trucks could not get to us. And they gave us what they called, you talk about K ration, they gave us what was called an emergency ration. And it was a chocolate bar about that big, very thick, and so very rich that all you could have was one bite at a time, and that was all. But it was nothing to be really enjoyed. It was just something to keep us alive. And lo and behold, about 3 or 4 days in, a mail truck caught up with us. And there was a package in there for me, for my sister. And it had food in it. Crackers and jam, salami. Well, there were 15 of us in the radio section, and I can guarantee you that package disappeared in 15 seconds. Well, eventually we pulled back into Sedan, France for regrouping. But the experience of being in the Battle of the Bulge was one which I would not want to repeat. The conditions were terrible. It was winter time. It was very, very cold, very snowy, and a situation which we were very, very fearful of our lives every minute. And we were glad when we got back into Sedan to regroup and then eventually get back into the combat and chase the Germans all the way back to Berlin. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Get back to our minute C. Did either of you have any particularly close calls with subs, mines, air raids, really bad weather? I know there's bad weather. Go ahead and we'll start here with George, and then you can join in.
Either we were so good at convoying that we didn't see any subs, or there weren't any out there. But the only thing we blew up was a lot of fish and one poor whale who came dizzily to the surface. The only danger that you were aware of was the fact that every time if you think of the Atlantic Ocean, you'll see it comes to a bottleneck 8 miles wide at the Straits of Gibraltar. And every convoy that was heading into that area had to go through those straits. And that's where the Germans would go ahead and hold their submarines in the ravines and the folds of the ocean there. And if you came through and happened to be there, they might have a chance to torpedo you. But what would be disconcerting sometimes, you would get what they call a Huff-Duff report, which would indicate the fact that there were maybe 6, 8, or 10 sightings of German submarines ahead of your convoy. And I know that every time we went through the Straits, we always slept in our clothes. That one day going through the Straits of Gibraltar. And the British would send out their finest and best destroyers to help us get through. But we were very lucky, or ourselves, so we were very good as Coast Guardsmen. And we wound up losing no vessels at all in our particular situation. Those of you who are movie fans, you remember looking at some of these pictures in World War II, which we're speaking about, and you remember maybe there were pictures you see of these life rafts rocking in the ocean, but for Hollywood effects, you might find a corpse attached to it. We saw a number of these empty rafts from ships that had been sunk, ships that guys like Bob had been on, but we never saw any human beings. A lot of flotsam and jetsam, but there was no other indication. So that's about as close as we knew that the Germans were around, but we kept them running.
Yeah, well, I was 24 on Sunday, and on Monday I was skipper of the Liberty ship Lilian Nordica, named after an Australian opera star. The first trip we were supposed to leave on Christmas Eve, and the convoy name was the Christmas Carolers. We were unable to leave because too many of the boys went out and had a little bit of the drink, and we didn't have crew enough to sail. So we sailed right after Christmas. We had a good trip across. We had American escorts, and when you had American escorts, they had a destroyer in front of the convoy with the convoy commander. On each corner they had a DE, and they circled the convoy at all times, and then once in a while, out of about 10 miles, you would see another circle of DEs and destroyers. So we had a safe trip across until we got over and we anchored in the Downs off of Dover, England. And then they ordered us over to Antwerp. And we got underway and went single file across. Oh, we were underway about, maybe a half hour. And the third ship in the convoy was torpedoed. And he went down. And then the sixth ship was torpedoed. He went down. And I started counting, and we were the ninth ship. And so we all held our breath. And evidently it was a two-man sub, and he had 2 torpedoes ready to fire, and he got the third ship and the sixth ship, and we made it across. But for a while there, why we were holding our breath pretty much.
Very good. The subject of letters and mail call has come up. Do any of you have any particularly vivid memories of mail call, receiving mail from home?
This isn't a vivid memory, but it probably is I don't know know what category to put it into, but you know, all mail was censored going out to the States. And just as you may have seen, and maybe I think this has been a humorous part of some show on where the sailor is writing to several girls at the same time, and he writes the same letter, but he just puts a different name on it. And that actually happened. We were sitting in the wardroom reading the mail as was required. Someone had to go and read it, and it was the same thing going over and over to the same girl, or in his particular situation. Of course, what happened was he mixed it up and put down Dear Eileen instead of Dear Edna, or what it was supposed to be. And I'm sorry to say that a consensus was the fact we'd just leave the mail it was, and we just let it go out.
Anybody else?
Well, it goes without saying that mail from home was one of the most important things to a soldier overseas. It was his only connection to the life he had lived before. Mail was very important to me and to my wife, to the extent that in the 2 years that I was in service, we exchanged 1,261 letters. Those 1,261 letters are now in the Library of Congress as part of the History Veterans Project. I remember during the month of July 1944 alone, we exchanged 80 letters. Those letters meant an awful lot, both not only to me, but to my wife at home with our little infant daughter. Mail was one of the most important things in our life in those days, and the Army and the Navy recognized that, and they made every effort to get our mail through and deliver mail to us. So that even, as I said, during the Battle of the Bulge, when we couldn't get food, the mail truck came by with mail for us. I cannot overemphasize the importance of mail from home to a soldier fighting in a war.
Yes, I don't know what we'd do without the mail. My fiance just corresponded with me practically daily, and I did too. I'd crawl in my hole at night when I could, when we ceased fire, and lit my little candle, got out my little book, and send the old V-mails. I don't know if you people know what the V-mails are, but they're a sheet of paper that they put out, the standard sheet, and then you write your message on. Then it's photographed, I guess, and shipped over on film. And when it gets to the States, they reprint it and send it out to you, the recipients. It was sort of a streamlined way of sending messages back to the States.
Yeah, in the merchant service, we were home about well, according to how long the trip was. It was a 9-month trip, a 6-month trip, but a lot of the trips were only 2 or 3 months long, so we didn't get a lot of mail, and the mail we did get was censored so much that you couldn't make much out of it anyway. Talking about sailors getting letters and their girls, I had a girl in every port. That young lady in the wheelchair down here used to come if we're docking in Baltimore or Philadelphia or New York. I had a girl in every port.
I'd just like to add that packages were so important because when we were in the Battle of Bulge, food was scarce. And my fiance knitted me a sweater, and it came about that time. I wore that thing, I don't know how many months, till spring, I guess. And when I got home, she said, "What'd you do with that sweater I knitted?" I said, "I burned it." It was so dirty.
Now, Joe, you were out there for a long, long time from that time you landed in southern France, right?
Well, there is so much to tell you, and the memories never leave you. But one of the things, it's kind of bad because I was only 18, and us 18, 19, and 20-year-olds fighting the Germans were 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And the idea is you have to kill them faster than they can kill you. That's brutal. And that wasn't brought up like that. And I had to get in my head that, at least I tried, that German soldier out there is just a thing, and that thing is trying to kill me, so I have to do it first. That's how I kind of try to hold my senses together.
I'm not letting you off the hook. You were in the Army of Occupation after the war ended in Europe. And I understand that you learned a little bit of German that you would share when you were in the Army of Occupation.
They won't allow me to say the words I've learned.
Yes, they will. Go ahead.
Well, it happened to be when I was, after the war, I was put into the Army of Occupation as a military police. And at that particular time, General Patton was killed in an automobile accident right outside of Heidelburg. And they picked 12 of us guys, MPs, to be on his honor guard. And I thought that was quite an honor. And I was stationed at the head of his coffin. And when nobody was around, I was leaning over counting his ribbons.
I did want you to share that story, but apparently you're not going to tell the story about sharing chocolate with the Germans in the Army of Occupation. No, okay. John Sudik, you also have a story about a close encounter with Patton.
Yes, we got involved with General Patton and the breakthrough and so forth, and also down in Czechoslovakia. But at first I'd like to say that our unit supported 3 armies. We were what they call a bastard unit. You didn't belong to a division, but you were placed in a place when they wanted to start an attack or stop an attack. And you didn't get any rest. You're always in the line. And we supported 16 infantry divisions in Europe, across Europe, and 1 airborne division. That's the 82nd in the Battle of Bulge. And 3 armored divisions. So you can see we had quite a selection of people that we helped. And they just loved us. They loved our artillery fire. And we fired over 50,000 rounds in our battalion of 95 pounds projectiles. We were in 11 months of combat from Omaha Beach to Czechoslovakia. I personally slept in over 200 holes in the ground. Never slept in a house. Once in the great while on the ground, but always in a hole. And in the wintertime, we dug a hole that could accommodate 2 people. So 2 of us slept together so we can keep warm. But at the end of the war, we ended up in Czechoslovakia, and I was transferred out of my unit because I could speak a little of the language. And General Patton came into our area to see our colonel and and bring his entourage. And they came down for a hunting expedition. They hunted and they shot deer and pheasants and ducks. And for 3 nights, they had banquets in this town of Bor, Czechoslovakia. And they had banquets and they were in there pouring the juice every night. But Patton had a high-pitched voice, not like if you ever saw Patton the movie. George Scott had a sort of a low, gruff voice, but Patton had a higher-pitched voice. But it was quite a situation to be involved with him. I took pictures of him and so forth at that time.
And also, you tried to impress him with your helmet.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. I was so involved in the language bit that in the headquarters battery, they used me as an interpreter to take care of any problems came in with the Czech civilians, and they talked the language, and I had to interpret for our officers. Well, consequently, I could barter. We had a German warehouse full of German beef and anything imaginable that the Germans confiscated from the civilians. So I had to take some of these cans of beef and barter for different things like fresh vegetables and baked goods for my outfit. They were eating the best of any outfit around. But I also had the helmet liner, and Patton was spit and polish. Well, I knew this painter in this town, and I said, put on about 10 coats of lacquer on that helmet. Boy, that thing shined, boy, and Patton looked at me, he kept looking at me, because mine was twice as good as his.
I thought you were supposed to try not to get noticed. Do any of you have any vivid memories of close buddies that you had during your time in the service during World War II? Anything you'd like to share?
Was it close buddies? Well, I can't. Let me say this: it's unusual in a service when you have 16.1 million people total that were enrolled in World War II to wind up with someone from your hometown on a ship, much less more than 2 ships. But I was on 2 ships, and on the first one I met my friend who now lives in Fallston, Maryland, as assistant engineering, and I was the assistant supply officer. And I left the ship on promotion, and about a year later, I was in New York Harbor when we came in from convoy, and I was in the commissary ship's door, and I hear this familiar voice, and it turns out to be Jake, our ship was the PF-99, his ship was the PF-100, surprisingly enough. They usually don't keep you together that way. But he had actually pulled alongside of us in New York and came aboard ship knowing that I was there, and I was able, with the permission of my commanding officer, and since he was replacement, the new commanding officer he had didn't know him particularly, so we were able to arrange a swap, which is very unusual wartime, and so Jake became the engineering officer of the PF-99. So that was an indication of perhaps a friendship situation. The other thing that I would like to remark about is when on a Liberty ship, and Bob would know this because he was on one, they were very slow. 10 knots was about 11 miles an hour was the top speed, and we towed a ship that was, or a cargo, or I should say a concrete oil replacement that was 58 feet longer than we were and drew 2 feet more in draft. And I got a hold of the steaming log not too long ago, and Jake had put down on the fact that we had gone 32 days and 22 hours in the same direction, which was going from San Francisco down to Auckland, New Zealand. Now, as far as friendship is concerned, I was impressed by the friendship of the people in New Zealand, because I was there during a Sunday and I was permitted to go ashore, and what was I thought a very emotional situation then and still is. I went to church, and as what usually happens in the church, at least in wartime, they would sing a hymn and then they would sing the national anthem. And this particular time, the pastor was up in his little raised podium, and he looked down and said he noticed there were a number of Americans in the audience, and would we please sing the American national anthem, which they did, and I was surprised because they even knew the second and third verses. And I was standing there so surprised to realize the fact that here were these total strangers singing my song.
Yeah, I took a new ship out of Wilmington, North Carolina, the Augustus S. Merriman, a Liberty ship. I was chief mate. We went to Charleston and loaded 9,000 tons of aerial bombs. And the aerial bombs come without their fins or the detonator in them. And they come down in the truck, and they use a special sling, very carefully load them aboard. And we had Coast Guard, we had Army, we had Navy, we had local fire department and ammunition specialists aboard to see that we didn't carry a lighter, and they checked their shoes to make sure we didn't have any nails sticking through the shoes. And they were very careful, so we loaded the 9,000 tons and then went up to Norfolk and loaded 1,000 tons of general PX cargo. We made a trip across to Iran, North Africa, and in Iran they offloaded the 1,000 tons of PX cargo, beer and everything for are military men. And then they said, we'll fill you up with another 1,000 tons of aerial bombs, and we were bound up for Italy. And I was standing on deck, and this big Army truck comes down loaded with bombs. He does a 180, backs up full speed, hits the brakes, and all the daggone bombs come falling off the back of the truck. I got a few gray hairs that day. Then the detonators were stored with the Finns, and they were in a square box about that big. And they very carefully handled them. But those North African stevedores, they had no regard. They'd land those boxes of detonators and Finns in the square of the hatch, and they'd throw them clear across the hatch. And you couldn't stop them. But if you had a container, a drum of anything, they were scared of it, because a drum of something, I don't know what it was, blew up in the harbor and took out a ship. And if it was a drum of water or a drum of gasoline or whatever it was, those gooks handled it very carefully.
Thanks. Anybody else have any memories of buddies or anything, any other vivid memories you'd like to share?
Well, you mentioned before friendships. One of the remarkable things about being in a war situation is the camaraderie that you get when you're with a small group of people. There were 15 of us in the radio section, and these people became my family. And in effect, they were for the 2 years. And that's one of the saving factors, because it's what helps you get along on a day-to-day basis. Unfortunately, like a lot of things, when the war was over and we all went our different ways, that was the end of it. But for the 2 years that we were together, they were my family.
Do you have any buddy memories that you'd like to share, or any other vivid memories of your time in the service?
I'll tell you one. Well, it's all, you have so many, you take hours. But one thing that sticks in my mind, it was in the Bulge mountains in France, and the terrain was so rough that you couldn't get tanks or artillery up. And there was a book on it called When the Odds Were Even. It was just an infantryman against an infantryman. And we were leading the column in the Bulge mountains. We come around a sharp curve, and the first two scouts went around, then our Browning automatic man went around, and then the sergeant went around. And I was just stepping my foot to go around the curve, and a machine gun opened up and took them all out. And I fell back against a bank, just shaking and tears. Then they put our squad back into the middle of the column. Then when I walked by and looked at the four guys there, and you went out on leave together and got drunk together, although I was too young. But it just as I went by them, I just cried like a baby. For them, and then one more step, it could have been me. And I guess I have a lot to be thankful for.
George, go.
I know I've heard some heroic stories here, but you know what I think when you get older, and we all do, unfortunately, I look out on this audience and I look at this little microcosm of us and a little larger, if there is such a thing as a larger microcosm of you people out there, and I can't even see because the lights are in the eyes, but I know there are some people who are in my age era, which is the greatest generation supposedly. But what you've got to realize is the fact that we were in uniforms, but you were in your regular clothes, and you had your overalls and your jackets and your blouses and your aprons and so forth and so on. But it was you who built and made the supplies that he carried and I safeguarded and these guys used and fought and won the war. So thank you.
Tom, I was, a lot of people wondering how we kept clean over there. Well, you know, you're like a bunch of animals, you live in a hole and so forth, and probably I think I can recall about 3 times during 11 months, they'll pick about 10 guys, put you on a truck and take you back about 2-3 miles, and they have a shower facility. You strip naked, you go take your shower, you run down the line, they give you not a new set of clothes, but a wash set of clothes. And then you're on your way again. But generally, you know, we all stunk. We smelled, but we all smelled the same, and we didn't notice it, you know. But they say, remember General MacArthur went to Congress and he gave a speech when he was fired by Truman, and he said, old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And we have a saying amongst our friends in the service that I know, old soldiers never die, we just smell that way.
And Joe, you have something here to share?
Well, when I first came home, I had a terrible time sleeping, so I had to go out in the backyard and dig a foxhole so I could get some sleep.
Any of the others of you have any trouble adjusting to civilian life after you did get back?
No, I sailed up until 1948, mostly between New York, Antwerp, Rotterdam. Then the company I was sailing with went out of business, and so in 1950 I joined the Coast Guard. But any of you people would like to learn what life is like at sea, go to Baltimore and board the John W. Brown. She's one of the 2 existing Liberty ships that is operating. There's the Jeremiah O'Brien on the West Coast and the John Brown in Baltimore. I took her out new in 1942 as second mate, and it would be a good experience to go aboard and see what the quarters were like and how people did live at sea.
Anyone else have any final thoughts that they'd like to share? I'd like to encourage all of you who, if you haven't done so yet, record your history somehow, some way. Audio tape, videotape, write it down. Record your history of your time in service and submit it to the Veterans History Project. It's very important. I've interviewed John and Joe DeLuca for the project. And I'd like to talk to these guys too. I don't know. But definitely think about doing that, and there's material all over the place that will tell you how to do that. All right, thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.